Nuclear meltdowns. They're some of the most terrifying disasters humanity has ever faced. From 3 Mile Island to Chernobyl, these catastrophes have led to abandoned cities, the displacement of thousands, and hazardous cleanup lasting decades. The most recent of these nuclear disasters was the 2011 Fukushima meltdown in Okuma, Japan. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant experienced a full meltdown in March of 2011, leading to the evacuation of thousands and ongoing cleanup costing billions. The heavy toll of Fukushima led to countless investigations into the facility, all to figure out what led to this disaster. Today, I want to go through some of these reports, take a deep dive into Fukushima Daiichi, and hopefully answer why Fukushima failed. While the factors that led to Fukushima's disastrous meltdown are numerous, its primary cause was the 2011 Great Tohoku Earthquake, along with the tsunami that accompanied it. To put into perspective just how bad this earthquake was, it was literally the strongest earthquake ever recorded by Japan, and the 4th strongest earthquake, well, ever. The earthquake and tsunami devastated the northeast coast of Japan, and Fukushima Daiichi was in a region heavily affected by this disaster. When the earthquake began on March 11, 2011, safeguards were triggered at Fukushima, and their active reactors were immediately shut down. Under normal circumstances, nuclear reactors generate vast quantities of heat to produce steam, that then turns a turbine for electricity. By shutting these reactors down, the engineers at Fukushima killed the vast majority of heat being generated, preventing a rapid and severe meltdown. However, even with the reactors shut down, there still remained the risk of a meltdown. You see, nuclear reactors work by splitting atoms apart, a process known as nuclear fission. Nuclear fission generates a vast quantity of heat and energy, but also produces radioactive isotopes of smaller atoms. These smaller, radioactive atoms gradually release heat as they undergo radioactive decay, the aptly named decay heat. A nuclear reactor can immediately shut down the heat produced by nuclear fission, but needs to gradually cool off this decay heat. This is typically achieved by pumping coolant water in and out of the reactor for hours, even days, to achieve a cold shutdown. In the case of Fukushima, they were able to stop heat from the main fission reaction, but ran into trouble when controlling the decay heat. Fukushima's coolant pumps utilized power produced by the plant itself, but would shift to external or emergency sources of power if the reactors shut down. The problem was that the earthquake caused massive damage to local infrastructure, meaning Fukushima was cut off from external power. Fortunately, on-site diesel generators were installed to operate these coolant pumps in case of an emergency. Unfortunately, many of these generators were rendered inoperable when the tsunami hit and flooded the rooms they were in. The flooding killed the generators in 5 of Fukushima's 6 reactors, leaving only Reactor 6 the ability to pump coolant, though it was able to operate Reactor 5's pumps as well. Ironically, Reactors 4, 5, and 6 all happened to be shut down for maintenance when the earthquake struck, and less in need of coolant pumping than Reactors 1, 2, and 3. The result was the slow buildup of decay heat in the first 3 reactors, which would culminate in their eventual meltdown in the days to come. A side effect of the heat buildup in these reactors was the generation of explosive hydrogen gas. The internals of the reactors were built with zirconium alloys, and at temperatures over 1200 Celsius, zirconium reacts with water to form pure hydrogen. The highly flammable hydrogen gas resulted in explosions in reactors 1 through 4, causing damage to the facility, injuries to local response teams, and the further spread of radioactive materials. It took several days for coolant to actually be pumped to reactors 1, 2, and 3, but by the time it arrived, full meltdowns had already occurred in all 3 reactors. By April, nearly 3 weeks later, the situation at Fukushima was more or less under control, just at the cost of several lives and the early decommissioning of the power plant. Ultimately, the Fukushima nuclear disaster resulted in hundreds of billions in cleanup costs, the evacuation of over 150,000 people, and the irradiation of much of Japan and the Pacific. On the surface, it's easy to chalk up Fukushima to the Great Tohoku Earthquake. The awful conditions and destruction from the tsunami was a freak, unprecedented event that overwhelmed the facility. However, there's more to this story than an unexpected earthquake. 4 other nuclear power plants were in operation during the Great Tohoku Earthquake, and in all 4 cases, the plants shut down properly. Even the Fukushima Daiichi power plant, just 7 miles south of Fukushima Daiichi, was under control within 2 days. This, of course, begs the question: if every other nuclear plant could withstand the earthquake and tsunami, why was Fukushima the only one that failed? Japan is situated squarely on the Ring of Fire, an area of intense geological activity. Earthquakes and tsunamis have rocked Japan throughout history and are a perennial concern for the nation. Because of this, Japanese construction projects are typically built with this in mind, and are often designed to withstand or mitigate the damage brought about by natural disaster. The issue with Fukushima Daiichi was, it wasn't really built with this in mind. This is not to say Fukushima was just randomly plopped down and built with chicken wire and duct tape. Efforts were made to protect the facility from earthquakes and tsunamis. Examples include building the facility well above sea level, constructing a seawall to stop tsunamis, and heavily earthquake-proofing their emergency response center. However, there were a few critical flaws in its design that ultimately culminated in its catastrophic end. These issues fundamentally surrounded the coolant pump systems, and more specifically, keeping them safe and powered. To cut a long story short, the wrong location was chosen for the emergency power systems, the coolant pumps, and really the facility itself. Rather than keeping emergency power at a higher elevation, the generators were located in the basement of each reactor in rooms that weren't waterproofed. When the tsunami finally hit Fukushima, the storage rooms were quickly flooded, rendering the plant's emergency power useless. The location of the coolant pumps was suboptimal as well, as they were also subjected to flooding during the tsunami. In addition, while Fukushima was built with a seawall to help stop tsunamis, concerns were raised that it wasn't tall enough. A sufficiently strong earthquake, one above magnitude 7 or 8, could trigger a tsunami capable of breaching the seawall and flooding the plant, which is exactly what happened. In short, while the Great Tohoku Earthquake would have posed a huge risk to Fukushima no matter what, efforts that could have fully mitigated these risks were not undertaken. The question now is, why weren't they? To talk about the shortcomings in Fukushima's design, we need to look at the company that built it. TEPCO, the Tokyo Electric Power Company, began construction of Fukushima Daiichi in 1967 using designs and materials supplied by General Electric. Potential risks emerged before construction even began on the facility. The initial site chosen for Fukushima was about 30 meters above sea level, but in order to streamline production, the construction site was leveled to be only 10 meters above sea level. Whereas the original height was fully insulated from tsunamis, this much lower height was at definite risk. Issues regarding this lower elevation were raised by engineers, but weren't taken seriously. The higher-ups thought a tsunami tall enough to reach Fukushima couldn't happen, in spite of legitimate concerns and historical precedent to the contrary. Regarding the location of pumps and emergency power storage, the GE blueprint specified they be placed beneath the reactors. Again, engineers raised concerns that emergency power would be susceptible to flooding in case of a tsunami, but higher-ups at TEPCO went along with it anyway. The concerns regarding Fukushima's relatively low elevation and questionable placement of emergency power were raised not just during its construction, but in the years that followed. In 1990, regulators from the US noted that the failure of Fukushima's emergency power was one of its biggest risks. This was brought to TEPCO's attention and ignored. In 1991, flooding in Reactor 1 caused one of its emergency generators to fail. TEPCO responded by installing flood-safe doors, but not actually waterproofing the rooms themselves. In 2000, an in-house report from TEPCO stated they needed to provide better protection against flooding. Higher-ups at TEPCO dismissed this finding. In 2004, the Cabinet Office of Japan said that Fukushima could experience tsunamis higher than initially predicted, which would put the facility at risk. TEPCO ignored this warning. In 2008, yet another in-house report from TEPCO said that tsunami waves could reach the plant, and that a taller seawall should be constructed. TEPCO dismissed the findings as unrealistic and ignored the recommendations. In short, TEPCO undertook no major efforts to protect Fukushima from tsunamis, and were completely fine with the facility up till 2011, of course. The suboptimal state of Fukushima was thanks largely to the apathetic leadership of TEPCO, but also due to a lax regulatory environment in Japan. The Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency, or NISA, was a government regulatory agency meant to oversee nuclear power in Japan. The problem is that NISA was awful at regulation and open to collusion. Up till Fukushima, there was a broad drive in Japan to promote and support nuclear power as a source of energy. This conflict of interest led to NISA prioritizing the interest of the nuclear industry rather than the public good. This, coupled with the fact TEPCO outright colluded with NISA itself, meant that best practices were not adopted at Fukushima. It was this lax and corrupt regulation which allowed for Fukushima's poor design and short seawall, and in turn set the facility up for disaster. Thanks to a mix of corporate greed and government corruption, Fukushima was kept in a precarious state. In the end, no significant measures were taken to limit the potential harm of a tsunami, in spite of a laundry list of warning signs and red flags. And the results speak for themselves. After the dust had settled and stability was returned to the region, The people of Japan wanted to know why Fukushima ended in catastrophe. In October of 2011, the Fukushima Nuclear Accident Independent Investigation Commission, or NICE, was formed to investigate the matter. An official report was released in July of 2012, and their findings were scathing. The head of the commission, Kiyoshi Kurakawa, described Fukushima as a man-made disaster, saying that the government, regulatory authorities, and TEPCO lacked a sense of responsibility to protect the people's lives and society. The report found that collusion between TEPCO and government regulators allowed the company to skirt regulations with near impunity. This, of course, led to woefully inadequate safety measures and training at the facility, which ultimately led to Fukushima's meltdown. Because of concerns and regulatory issues surrounding the nuclear industry, nuclear power rapidly lost public favor in Japan, and almost every nuclear power plant in service was shut down for a time. The topic of nuclear energy is highly divisive to this day, and the majority of Japan's nuclear infrastructure has been decommissioned or mothballed ever since. In terms of actual punishment and blame for Fukushima, the Japanese government took responsibility for its poor handling of the crisis and lax regulations on the nuclear industry. Since then, efforts have been made to enact stronger regulations and reform the nuclear industry in Japan, though for an industry much smaller in size now. Regarding TEPCO, there have been ongoing indictments against former executives, and in July of 2022, 4 former execs were found guilty of negligence for Fukushima. Further lawsuits and indictments against TEPCO are ongoing, and efforts remain to receive remuneration and compensation for their abject negligence. In spite of these positive steps to clean up the nuclear industry and hold people to account, the damage brought about by the Fukushima nuclear disaster will remain for decades, and countless Japanese citizens remain displaced from their homes. There is a lingering fear, both in Japan and abroad, about the possibility of another nuclear catastrophe. Thanks to the high-profile disasters of 3 Mile, Chernobyl, and of course Fukushima, nuclear power is often regarded with caution and anxiety. In spite of this, nuclear remains one of the largest sources of energy on Earth, and will likely grow in prominence as fossil fuels slowly dry up. If nuclear power is here to stay, how can we make sure it's safe? Just as Fukushima is a tragedy, so too is it a cautionary tale of sorts. TEPCO heavily colluded with members of the Japanese government to skirt regulations with Fukushima, all to cut corners and save a few yen. The short-sighted higher-ups were unwilling to spend millions to safety-proof a facility, whose meltdown cost the company in Japan billions. Proper, independent regulation is of the utmost importance for any industry, with nuclear power being no exception. 3 Mile, Chernobyl, and Fukushima have shown that in its absence, catastrophe is much more likely, if not guaranteed. On the flip side, the nuclear plants that withstood the Tohoku earthquake are shining examples of how nuclear power can be done right. Looking specifically at the Onagawa nuclear plant, it experienced incredibly minimal damage despite actually being closer to the earthquake's epicenter. The reason for this comes down to Onagawa's higher elevation compared to Fukushima Daiichi, along with the insanely tall seawall built to protect the plant. Onagawa's seawall was about as tall as the tsunami it experienced, which prevented any major flooding and let the plant easily achieve a cold shutdown. On top of that, after the earthquake and tsunami had passed and stability was returned to Onagawa, they built an even taller seawall just to be safe. Outside of Onagawa, you see properly and reasonably managed nuclear plants throughout the European Union. The reason for this comes from an incident similar to Fukushima that happened in late 1999. The French Blaye nuclear plant experienced minor flooding due to a storm surge in December of 1999. While no major incident transpired and the plant achieved a cold shutdown, there was a genuine risk of meltdown. This close call triggered a massive reevaluation of nuclear power throughout the EU, specifically regarding how they could make the industry even safer. As a result, Europe operates some of the safest and most efficient nuclear plants in the world, and comfortably relies on them for a large sum of their energy. To wrap things up, I don't want to gloss over the harm and damage brought about by Fukushima. It's a genuine tragedy, and I hope the people of Japan can find recourse and solace in its wake. However, the cause of Fukushima, the reason Fukushima failed, is not a feature of nuclear power, but a bug brought about by greed and apathy. It's a technology that can and probably should work, as long as governments and the people have the will to keep it safe. Hopefully we can learn and integrate the lessons of Fukushima, and hopefully the double-edged sword of nuclear power can be properly wielded going forward. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you want to learn more about the science and history behind nuclear power, and more specifically nuclear weapons, check out this video where I go more in depth. It also helps me out tremendously in the algorithm if you go from one video of mine to another, So if you want to see more videos like this, that's the best way to help. With that out of the way, fist bump the like, make out with the subscribe button, and that bell. Until next time, take care.